kicks the goal. Making something out of nothing.
Malcheski, is that the grand final?
Jimmy Bartell can make a hero of himself.
That is a brilliant snap. He's kicked the goal and Freeman to win it after the siren. What a game of football at the MCG.
Welcome to The Protected Zone, the most fascinating AFL podcast on the internet. We look at all the interesting parts and the uninteresting parts of this great game of ours. You can subscribe to The Protected Zone at iTunes, you can listen to us on SoundCloud or YouTube, or you can even go to our website, theprotectedzone.com. In this great episode, we review the second week of AFL finals.
2 hours is a long time in football, but how long is a week?
Boredom. Have the AFL finals been boring, and what can we do about it?
We preview the 2 preliminary finals.
And our song for the week, Use It or Lose It. I'm Eddie J in the Sydney studio.
And I'm Linton and I'm in Padang with Sumatra in the heart of Indonesia, where Merah Putih, red and white rules.
Well, red and white no longer rules in AFL. So we've had a difficult finals season so far. We got all of our predictions wrong again. Now collectively, we've only got one game out of 12 correct. If we were coaches, we would have been sacked by now.
Oh, you call it, this is I think the finals did not stand up to our expectations. This year has been, as we often called it, oddly even year. It's 2017, so it's odd year, but the season, home and away season, has been so even to the extent that anything could happen. But come September, everything is so predictable, and we've got the top 4 teams left for the final week 3 of the finals. How predictably boring! And I think, Eddie, we have been in this sort of mode that, anything could happen. Oh, yes, maybe this team, that team. No, it doesn't happen. Anything like that.
Yeah, so I think that we did treat ourselves to a fantastic home and away season this year where unpredictable things happen, the unexpected happen. All sorts of strange things happen. We even had 2 draws in a row. But the final series, I actually disagree with you slightly when you say that it has been predictable. It's been a little bit unpredictable in the sense that we've had so many blowouts. I didn't expect to see this many blowouts. Out of the 6 games that we've had so far, 5 of them have been over by half time.
Yeah. I mean, traditionally finals games are meant to be a bit like that because the nature of the game is that once the game seems to be out of your reach, players start dropping off and start thinking about their Mad Mondays and maybe an off-season trip, bonding trips to Bali or something. They should come to Sumatra, by the way. Finals games tend to be, I think, sort of one-sidedness by half-time. One side, we're playing for next week. The other team, we're gone.
So let's start off with the Friday night game between Geelong and Sydney. It was the Cats and the Birds. The Cats got their claws out and they plucked the feathers off the Swans. The Swans were expected to win this game very handsomely, but it was Geelong that put all the heat on the Swans. What happened in this game, Lintang?
Well, we predicted the Swans to win, but I remember discussing the Cats may put Patrick Dangerfield in the forward line, and Chris Scott might have been listening to our podcast, and he decided to put the Dangerfield to exactly where we suggested, and he played a significant role. Danger kicked 4-3, I think, for the game, and all his goals came in the first half when the game was still on, so to speak. And not just kicking goals in forward line, he had 26 positions, 8 marks and 4 tackles. So he had a brilliant game, and Chris Scott to move him over there was a brilliant move. I think that was one of the key elements in Geelong overcoming Sydney. And it was an amazing turnaround because Geelong kicked only 5 goals in the previous week against Richmond, I think. And this game, they kicked 15 goals and winning by more than 10 goals, or nearly 10 goals. It was just an amazing turnaround, and it was all by this move of danger to forward. So, the key players made a big spark for Geelong, while Sydney, didn't even come to play.
No, they didn't come to play at all, but it was interesting listening to Patrick Dangerfield after the game because he was asked about who the best players were for the team, and he said, well, the best player for Geelong was Chris Scott, the coach, because he just coached so brilliantly. Now, obviously, Chris Scott was not on the ground. He was up in the coach's box, but he just produced masterstroke after masterstroke, and his counterpart, the coach of the Sydney Swans, John Longmire, he looked like he had better things to do in the coaching box. He must have known that it was on an off night for the Sydney Swans and there wasn't much that he could actually do.
Yes, it was, you got to remember, Sydney was in such a good form. They haven't lost any games except Hawthorn twice, and this since they're early in the season. They opened the season with the no win, 6 losses, but since they haven't lost any games except for Hawthorn, and it's just like Back to the Future kind of deja vu moment. Oh, is this Sydney at the beginning of the season? It was so dysfunctional. No one seems to be interested except for a few players, Nothing was working. I think it may be because Lance Franklin got injured last week, and that had an influence, do you reckon?
I think it did have an influence. Maybe he was more injured than the Sydney Swans were letting on as well, but I think it was something more than just Lance Franklin being injured. There was something wrong about the entire team, and that's okay. Sometimes teams do have an off day, and it's not just a couple of players that have off days or off nights. But the entire team, there was just something that didn't go well for them. The Sydney Swans played brilliantly for a 17-week period where they won 15 games and lost only 2 games. They had their bad match, the first one in a long time. Sometimes it happens to teams, and it just happened to the Sydney Swans at the wrong end of the season. I'm sure that they tried their best, but it was a bridge too far for them.
Yes, of course, Sydney had a few players who, didn't lower their colours. Like Heath Grundy was good in defence, and Dan Hannaberry was good. Kieran Jack, retiring champion Jared McVeigh was good. But everyone else, everyone else was had a off day, and with that sort of team, even Brisbane could have won.
Oh, they probably would have won. And you do know that at the protected zone, we do love our records. And it was Sydney's lowest score in a final since the 1909 grand final when they scored 4 goals and 14 behinds. And it was also their lowest score as the Sydney Swans in a final. And it was also the Sydney Swans' lowest score in any game at all since 1997. So record beaters, but not in the way that they would have expected.
Yes, it was surprising, the formula to beat Geelong. We discussed last week that Geelong are relatively slow starters. And Sydney, on the other hand, was, always switched on and bang on. In previous 2 encounters, Sydney kicked 7 goals in the opening quarters and blasting Cats away before Cats came to play. And we suggested that the Cats should start their games earlier, and by the time the first bounce, they're ready to go, kind of thing. Maybe Chris Scott did just that. On this day, Cats allowed Sydney to score only 2 goals in opening terms, and in the meantime, Cats piled on few goals. and leading the opening break by 5 points. That was very unlike the Cats and very unlike Sydney. And that was the sort of indication how they came to play.
So that's the end of the road for Sydney for this year. Geelong kick on against Adelaide next week, and we'll see how they go. There was a second finals match played on the weekend as well. It was Greater Western Sydney against West Coast. It was the Battle of the Wests, but only one team seemed to turn up. There was a strange feeling at the ground because only 14,000 people were at the ground. It was the smallest finals crowd since 1916, and it had a feel, for me, of a pre-season practice match in Wagga.
Yeah, a bit like that, and I think West Coast turned up a bit like that, I think they spent all their energy previous week against Port Adelaide, that epic match. And when they came to play in Sydney, I think their old legs are still very sore.
I think that would have been the case, but it was a case of the Eagles being too old, too slow, too tired. Greater Western Sydney were the opposite of that. They were too fast, too slick and too young. But looking at the West Coast Eagles, it was actually their oldest team ever on the field, and they've been around since 1987, so their oldest team in 31 seasons. That's amazing.
Yeah, and the team itself was a bit old, but in fact the older guys, a retiring trio, performed, much better than the relatively younger guys.
Well, one of the oldest players on the field was actually playing for Greater Western Sydney. It was Steve Johnson, and he ended up kicking 6 goals, and it was a superb masterclass of goal kicking. And it wasn't like you might think, well, maybe he scored a couple in the first quarter or the second quarter and then a few more in the third and the fourth quarter. But it all happened in 1.5 quarters. So he kicked 4 goals in the third quarter. Then he kicked another 2 goals in the first 5 minutes of the final quarter. So all up, he scored his 6 goals within the period of less than a quarter. So it was an amazing display of goal kicking.
It was explosive indeed. But the match was more or less decided at half time. So, Stevie J didn't have too much pressure except, for himself. But yes, surely it was explosive, and when it's ignited, bang, it was a good firework, and that could be the way to use a veteran like Stevie J. Instead of expecting them to play 4 full quarters, but the coaches can tell them, okay, you just concentrate on 10 minutes. 10 minutes. You kick 4 goals in 10 and you'll be the winner. That kind of approach. Yeah,
so Greater Western Sydney, they did get their mojo back, as a lot of people in the media were saying, and they completely ran over the top of West Coast Eagles. I think it was a case of West Coast, because they played that extra time in their previous finals. I think it was just, there was too much taken out of them in that previous game, and plus all of that travelling time. We did say that travelling time would become an issue, even though we did say that the West Coast Eagles were going to win this match, but it was a bridge too far for them.
Interestingly, have you noticed that now we don't have a Josh Kennedy anymore? Both Josh Kennedys gone.
Yes, that's an interesting point. Both Josh Kennedys, one plays for the Sydney Swans, that's Josh P. Kennedy, and the other one, Josh J. Kennedy, plays for the West Coast Eagles. So both of their teams have been eliminated from the final season, so no more Josh Kennedys. So that's a sad sight, but we'll see if they return next year. So you're listening to The Protected Zone. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, and you can listen to us on SoundCloud, YouTube, or you can go to our website, theprotectedzone.com. Up next, how long is a long time in AFL and the boredom of football?
Yeah, well, I say what I mean. I say what comes to my mind, because I never get around to things. I live a straight line, you know me, I'm acting dumb. You know the scene very humdrum. Boredom.
Let's discuss this, Lin Tang. How long is a long time in football?
Well. If your team is losing, it seems like an entire 2 hours seems to be way too much. And I'm pretty sure those fans of Sydney and West Coast Eagles thought, oh gosh, torture continues, and they probably walked out.
Well, the reason why I'm bringing up this idea of how long is a long time in football is that at 7:50 on Friday night, that's just a minute before the game started between Sydney and Geelong, Sydney was earmarked as one of the 3 likely teams to win the grand final. And for Geelong, it was the end of an era. They were unlikely to do anything except be kicked out of the finals. But then 2.5 hours later at 10:30, Geelong is now one of the flag favourites, and Sydney have got so many problems that we don't know where to start. Is Lance Franklin's contract worth it? He's no good. Sydney are the worst team ever. Do you think people have got brains like goldfish, or what is wrong with the media and what is wrong with supporters, and do they actually have an understanding of sport?
Well, I think it didn't take 2 hours to figure out. In fact, by halftime, Sydney was gone. And, I was just praising, wow, Patrick Dangerfield. Whew. So it may be not as agonizing as 2 hours, but you're right. Sometimes, especially during the finals, that sort of, all sorts of problems coming out in rather short time, but it seems like eternity.
Well, it does seem like an eternity, but Sydney had a bad game on Friday in the same way as Geelong had a bad game the week before, and the same way that Richmond might have a bad game next week. So it happens. Footballers are just like everyone else. There's games where everything just falls apart and you can't do anything about that. And that's just not in AFL. It's in virtually every sport. And if we didn't have this, situation, well, we may as well not turn up. Football would just be so predictable.
Yes, so, the results of finals can be very one-sided, as happened. And once your team is led by, say, 30 points or 40 points, the players give up, at half-time. Oh, right, our season is over.
Previously, we discussed the idea of the finals so far being absolutely and totally boring. Is it time to bring back the home and away season? What can we do about this boring final series?
Absolutely. I'm in the opinion to suggest that, let's scrap this final 8 and just bring everyone back in, 18 teams back in again, and we have 9 games, and one of them could be, upset, one of them could be a tie, one of them could be a thriller, that kind of, exciting home and away seasons. How could we decide it? I don't know, but maybe the top, the team ended up at the top. First week they play against the bottom side. In this case, in this year, Adelaide plays Brisbane, and so the lower side always play the highest remaining team or something, and we can have a big tournament. If Adelaide wins and Brisbane lost, yes, next following week Adelaide plays the winner or the lowest team still remaining, that kind of thing, and we just keep on going.
Well, one other suggestion that I had was that the AFL could set up a second series of finals, that the teams between 9 and 16, they play in an alternative premiership. So teams that finish 17 and 18, they can have a holiday because they're just not good enough. But the teams 9 to 16, that's 8 teams altogether, they'll just have an alternative round of finals. And I think that would be so exciting because we'd end up having 2 grand finals on the same day.
Yeah, but there won't be any upsets and nail biters and, Brisbane, Carlton, and occasionally Collingwood, they brought it, in sort of, unexpectedness. While, finals seem to be very, very sort of almost going to some kind of formal or something. Know the result, one way or the other, which we didn't, and that's why we got the tipping so wrong. But in a way, predictable.
Yes, and I was thinking about other ways that we could spice up this final series. Like, there's been talk about which team is going to wear their Clash Guernsey on the weekend, but I suggest that we actually set up real Clash jumpers, like from the band The Clash, like give them enough rope, or Sandinista or London Calling on the Guernsey. I can't think of anything more interesting.
Indeed, they should sort of touch it up so that they bring the excitement back. And by the way, what's the weather forecast? Is it going to be some wild weather happening in Melbourne?
So on Saturday, it's actually going to be quite warm in Melbourne. It's going to be 24 degrees and lots of rain. So it might end up being a slippery game. And Adelaide has got a different forecast. They've actually got fine weather on Friday night. So, yeah, the weather's not going to be anything unusual or anything interesting. So we can't look at the weather to make life a little bit more interesting. So there's no cyclones or hurricanes forecast or anything like that. So I'm not sure what else we can do to make the AFL series a little bit more interesting, except for hope for some high quality games on the weekend. So you're listening to The Protected Zone on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, or you can go to our website, theprotectedzone.com. Up next, the penultimate round of AFL finals. So we've got the second last round of AFL finals, so it's the last two finals before the grand final. And the first game is happening on Friday night. It's being played in Adelaide, and it's against Adelaide and Geelong. What can we expect to see in this great game on Friday night, Lin Tang?
There are only 4 teams left, and no Josh Kennedys. Gosh, it's a bit boring. For Adelaide fans and Geelong fans. I think Geelong has regained its form and formula. Patrick Dangerfield, their superstar, was the big spark. And obviously, one big question is, will Chris Scott play him up for the game, or will he put him in Dangerfield in the middle? And will Chris Scott tag Rory Sloane? All those questions. But Adelaide has got very good midfield. The Crouch brothers, they performed very well in the absence of Rory Sloane the week previously. So just tagging one player doesn't necessarily stop Adelaide run around. Geelong midfield was quite impressive against Sydney. Mitch Duncan, Sam Managola, Scott and Joel Selwood, they did all great job. It's going to be a very interesting midfield battle.
Well, interestingly enough, Patrick Dangerfield actually did play for Adelaide up until 2015. So it's going to be an interesting homecoming for him. And it will also be interesting to see how their 23rd player, as in Chris Scott, coaches on the day as well. So I think it's going to be a very, very interesting battle. And it will also be interesting to see how or what sort of influence the crowd has, because when Greater Western Sydney played there a couple of weeks ago, they only had about 100 supporters there out of the 51,000 people in attendance at Adelaide Oval. How many out of that 51,000 this weekend do you think will be Geelong supporters?
Well, it's a hard one, and that's the home ground advantage, and Adelaide make best use of home ground. And when Geelong plays at home in Cardinia Park, they get their fans dominating the crowd. So it is one of the rewards Adelaide got from playing so well throughout the home and away seasons. And I'd say 95% of the crowd will be Adelaide supporters, and has happened quite often in the home and away seasons. I think umpire decisions may be influenced by the crowd.
Oh, they always are influenced by the crowd, and I believe that what Chris Scott should possibly do is spring a total surprise on Adelaide. Instead of having Patrick Dangerfield playing forward or in the middle or in the back, he could actually leave him out of the team entirely, and Adelaide wouldn't know what to do with themselves.
Oh, yes, of course. And in return, I think Adelaide could leave out Tex Walker.
Yes, they could leave out Tex Walker, so it would be a process of elimination, and it would be a left field idea, of course, but, sometimes radical thinking needs to be implemented. I'm going for the home ground advantage here. I think that Geelong, for most of this year, have been an up-and-down team. Adelaide have been up for most of this year. Sure, they have an off game every now and then. They could have an off game just like the Sydney Swans did last week, but they've been very good performers throughout most of this year. They've got the home ground advantage. They're well rested. It's just a question of whether they're too well rested, because they did go off for a holiday to the Gold Coast last week. So it's just a question of whether they had too much of a holiday and how switched on they are.
Yes, that's hard. It's a factor to think about. They haven't played footy for a long time. They only played one game in 4 weeks or something because of the pre-finals bye. So they need to be switched on. But Geelong normally are slow starters. So the first opening quarter could be warm up time for both teams, and the results could be hinged. Or we often say the third quarter is a premiership quarter. I think the match will be decided in the third quarter. The second quarter, I'd say, is going to be a sort of even, and the third quarter, whoever kicks 6 goals to 2 will win the match.
Well, I still think that Adelaide will win this game.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I have to mention one. Pick one. Okay. Toss the coin. Adelaide.
On Saturday, we're going into the Twilight Zone again. There's a Twilight match being played on Saturday evening, and it's Richmond against the Greater Western Sydney. Richmond are into their first preliminary final since 2001, and it's the first time that they've had a home ground advantage in a preliminary final since 1995. Aside from the crowd of 95,000, and only 100 of those people will be Greater Western Sydney supporters, but Richmond are in with a pretty good chance in this game.
Well, yes, surprisingly, for a team, we kept asking, are they real deal? The Tigers are still there and, one game away from grand final. My God, they surely are a real deal by now.
We have been talking about Richmond being the real deal for all of this year. Now, you don't get into a preliminary final unless you are the real deal, but it's the same issue as Adelaide. Have they had too much time off, and did they have too much of a holiday?
Yes, that's unknown territory for the Tigers, who have hardly been to this deep into September, and one game away from grand finals. A surprise for many players, if not all, because they haven't been there. But it's the same with the GWS. The difference is GWS had to play, a few games while Tigers were just sitting down on their couch watching television, watching the other people playing, their matches. So that's a difference. Again, Tigers may take a few quarters or one quarter at least to get into the swing of things, while GWS just continue on from where they left last week. And I think this game could surprise everyone, and the GWS might make it to the first grand final.
Well, it should be an interesting match. Over the past couple of weeks, there has been this idea floating around in the media called the Orange Tsunami, and that's the Greater Western Sydney midfield just running through waves. Does Richmond have its Yellow Tsunami up and running?
Yes, the GWS has got such star players like Dylan Shield and Josh Kelly and Callum Ward. All very young, still, relatively inexperienced, but they know they gel together very well, and when they are switched on, they perform very well. And really a good match, I think. Again, the battle of midfield. I think Richmond might have a sort of. It's a sort of game, a weird game, because GWS had a bit of advantage with their height, but without Mummy and Jeremy Cameron, sort of like this game is going to be played by the midget team versus midget team, very un-AFL, but that could be an interesting spectacle.
It could be a very interesting spectacle, and we've also got another situation where a player of a former team is now up against them in a final. So Brett Delidio, he used to play for Richmond. He played for 238 games, and he's playing his 250th game, not for Richmond, but against Richmond. He's lining up for Greater Western Sydney. He made a switch at the beginning of the year, and it should be an interesting homecoming for him, playing in front of 95,000 people, but none of his supporters are going to be there except for the 100 Greater Western Sydney supporters. So it should be an interesting game for Brett Delidio.
And also the coach for GWS, Leon Cameron, didn't he used to play for the Tigers as well as the Dogs?
Yes, he used to play for Richmond as well as the Western Bulldogs. So the Western Bulldogs defeated Leon Cameron's coach team, Greater Western Sydney, last year. Is another one of his former clubs going to defeat him this year? So should be an interesting game, but I'm predicting that in keeping with the rest of the AFL final series this year, both of these matches are going to be boring. They'll be over at half time, and I think in this game Richmond should win against Greater Western Sydney, and they should win quite well. You're listening to The Protected Zone on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube and our website, theprotectedzone.com. Up next, our Song of the Week. Each week on The Protected Zone, we choose a Song of the Week, and a song that best epitomises the round that we've just had. And in this last round, we had two of the most boring finals that you'll ever come across, both over at half time. And the issue that we had was that there were teams that had a lot of skill, but they just didn't use it. Sydney Swans, they were a very, very good team for most of this year. A lot of skill, but they just didn't use it. West Coast Eagles, they were a very skillful team as well. A lot of quality, but they just didn't use it at all. So if you don't use it, you lose it. So our song for this week is by the Young Punks, and it's called You've Got To. And the Young Punks, I didn't actually know that much about them, but they're an electronic-based dance band, and they're a bit of a concept band where they use French house music, breakbeat, drum and bass, and they mix it up with all sorts of things from 1980s pop music, hard rock, disco and glam rock. So they're an interesting concept group. So let's go out with the Young Punks. Enjoy your week. Thanks for listening in, and we'll speak to you next week.
See you again, and 2 more rounds of 30 left in this exciting year of 2017. Hope it keeps up to our expectation.
Okay. For this next dance, move to the dance floor, take your pocket out